In the quiet halls of Hawthorne Foods, where the fluorescent lights hummed their endless song and the air carried the scent of fresh bread and possibility, 9-year-old Avery Scott pressed her ear against the cold metal door of a maintenance freezer. Her breath formed small clouds in the chilled air as she listened to something that would change everything. "There's someone in the freezer," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible above the mechanical symphony of the supermarket after hours. What Avery heard that December evening wasn't the settling of pipes or the rumble of refrigeration units. It was something far more human, far more desperate. 3 taps, a pause, 2 taps, another pause, 3 taps again. Like a heartbeat, like a code, like someone crying out in the only way they could. But who would believe a little girl with an overactive imagination? Who would listen to the adopted daughter of a busy CEO who already thought she spent too much time wandering the store's forgotten corners? Miles Hawthorne certainly wouldn't. Not at first. This is the story of how the smallest voice in the room became the one that mattered most. How intuition trumped logic. How a child's refusal to be dismissed saved not just a life, but the soul of a family business built on trust. Sometimes the most profound truths come wrapped in the simplest observations. Sometimes we must learn to listen with our hearts instead of our minds. And sometimes, just sometimes, it takes the faith of a child to remind us what it means to truly hear. Miles Hawthorne stood in his corner office on the 3rd floor of Hawthorne Foods' flagship store, watching the evening shift stalk the aisles below. At 45, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had earned every step of his journey from warehouse keeper to CEO. His hands, still bearing the calluses of his earlier years, rested on the windowsill as he observed the organized ballet of commerce unfolding beneath him. The store was his second home, and in many ways, it felt more familiar than his actual house. Every aisle told a story of struggle and success, of late nights spent reorganizing inventory systems and early mornings reviewing supplier contracts. Hawthorne Foods wasn't just a business to Miles. It was his legacy built one careful decision at a time from the foundation his grandfather had laid decades earlier. "Dad," Avery's voice drifted from the doorway, soft and tentative. She stood there in her purple winter coat backpack still slung over one shoulder, looking every bit the curious child who preferred exploring to sitting still. "Hey there, explorer," Miles said, turning from the window with a gentle smile. "How was school?" "Fine," she replied, though her attention was already elsewhere, drawn to the sounds and rhythms of the store. Avery had been part of his life for 2 years now, ever since the adoption papers were finalized. But sometimes Miles still marveled at how naturally she had fitted into the spaces of his world. The store had become her playground, its employees, her extended family. "Can I go get my ice cream?" she asked, referring to her after-school ritual of selecting a treat from the frozen food section. "Of course. Just stay where Jenny can see you," he said, referring to the evening manager who had become particularly fond of Avery's daily visits. Miles watched his daughter disappear down the hallway, her footsteps echoing against the polished floors. He had worried, when he first decided to adopt, whether he could balance the demands of single parenthood with the responsibilities of running a growing grocery chain. But Avery had proven to be remarkably adaptable, finding wonder in the mundane operations that most children would find boring. What he didn't know was that Avery's curiosity would soon lead her to discover something that had been hidden in plain sight for nearly a year. Something that would test everything he thought he knew about trust, about family, and about the courage it takes to believe in what seems impossible. Down in the store's lower level, past the employee break room and beyond the main storage areas, Avery made her way toward the frozen food section. The temperature dropped noticeably as she approached the industrial freezers, her breath beginning to mist in the cold air. She had always been sensitive to sounds, a trait that had served her well in her previous foster placements, where being able to hear approaching footsteps often meant the difference between safety and trouble. But tonight, as she passed the maintenance area near the back freezer units, she heard something that made her stop completely. It wasn't the usual mechanical hum of the refrigeration systems or the settling sounds of an old building. It was rhythmic, deliberate, almost like 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, pause, 3 taps again. Avery pressed her ear against the metal door of the maintenance freezer, her heart beginning to race. The sound was coming from inside, but that didn't make sense. The maintenance freezers were always locked, used only for storage of cleaning supplies and backup equipment. No one should be in there, especially not during evening hours. She listened for several more minutes, documenting the pattern in her mind. 323, over and over again, like someone was trying to send a message, like someone was trying to be heard. When she finally returned to her father's office 20 minutes later, ice cream forgotten Miles was finishing a phone call with their supplier in Portland. "Dad," she said quietly, waiting for him to hang up. "I think there's someone in the freezer." Miles looked at his daughter's serious expression and felt a familiar tug of both affection and gentle exasperation. Avery's imagination had always been vivid, a quality he generally encouraged, but lately her stories had been taking increasingly dramatic turns. "What kind of someone?" he asked, giving her his full attention. "I don't know, but I heard tapping, like a code. 3 taps, then 2, then 3 again. Over and over." Miles nodded thoughtfully, considering how to address this latest flight of fancy. "You know what that probably is. The refrigeration unit has been making some strange noises lately. Jenny mentioned it yesterday. Sometimes when the compressor kicks in, it makes a tapping sound against the housing. But Dad, it wasn't mechanical. It was human." The certainty in her voice gave him pause, but logic quickly reasserted itself. "Sweetheart, no one could be in those freezers. They're locked, and besides, even if someone were trapped, they'd be calling for help, not tapping." Avery's face fell slightly, but she nodded. She had learned in her 9 years when to push and when to accept adult explanations. But as they drove home that evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had heard something important, something that needed to be investigated. The tapping haunted Avery's dreams that night. She woke twice, convinced she could still hear the rhythm echoing in her mind, 323, 323. By morning, she had made a decision that would have surprised her former foster families, but wouldn't surprise Miles at all. She was going to investigate. At school, while her classmates focused on their math worksheets, Avery found herself sketching the layout of the store's basement level from memory. She marked the location of the maintenance freezer with a careful X, trying to remember every detail from the previous evening. Her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, noticed her distraction, but attributed it to the usual pre-holiday excitement that seemed to grip all the students this time of year. "Avery, can you tell us what 7 times 8 equals?" Mrs. Patterson asked, hoping to draw her back to the lesson. 56, Avery replied automatically, not looking up from her drawing. "Mrs. Patterson, if someone was trapped somewhere and couldn't call for help, how else might they try to communicate?" The question caught the teacher off guard. "Well, I suppose they might try to make noise or write a message if they had paper." "What about tapping like in code?" "I suppose that's possible. Morse code, for instance, uses different patterns of dots and dashes to represent letters." Avery's head snapped up with sudden interest. "How would you say help in Morse code?" Mrs. Patterson found herself drawn into the child's curiosity despite the interrupted lesson. She walked to the whiteboard and wrote out the letters. H is 4 dots, E is 1 dot, L is dot dash dot dot, and P is dot dash dash dot. But Avery, why are you asking about this? Just curious, Avery said, but her mind was racing. 323 wasn't Morse code, but it was definitely intentional. She was more convinced than ever that someone was trying to communicate from inside that freezer. After school, instead of going directly to her father's office as usual, Avery made her way to the store's employee break room. She had befriended several of the long-term workers over the past 2 years, and she knew that if anyone would have information about the store's history, it would be them. Jibisam, Jenny, she said, approaching the evening manager who was reviewing the day's delivery receipts. Have you ever heard strange noises from the basement freezers? Jenny looked up with a warm smile. She had grown particularly fond of Miles's daughter, appreciating the child's genuine interest in how the store operated. What kind of noises, sweetheart? Tapping sounds, like someone trying to get attention. The smile faded slightly from Jenny's face, replaced by a look of thoughtful concern. You know, now that you mention it, there have been some odd sounds down there lately. I assumed it was just the old equipment acting up. These buildings settle in weird ways, especially when the temperature changes. But what if it's not the building? Avery pressed. What if it's something else? Jenny studied the child's earnest expression. In her 15 years of working retail, she had learned to trust unusual observations, especially from people who spent a lot of time in the building. Tell you what, she said. Next time you hear it come, get me immediately. We'll investigate together. That evening, Avery positioned herself strategically near the frozen food section, while her father finished his end-of-day paperwork. She brought her homework as cover settling at a small table near the employee entrance where she could monitor the basement access without being too obvious about it. At exactly 7:30 p.m., just as the last customers were making their way to the checkout counters, she heard it again. The tapping was fainter tonight, but unmistakably present. 323, 323, like a desperate heartbeat echoing through the walls. This time she was prepared. From her backpack, she pulled out a toy stethoscope she had borrowed from her classroom's doctor playset. If there really was someone in there, she was going to gather proof. Moving quietly through the increasingly empty store, Avery made her way to the basement level. The maintenance area was darker than usual, with only the emergency lighting providing illumination. The temperature dropped significantly as she approached the freezer units, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. She pressed the stethoscope against the metal door of the maintenance freezer and immediately heard it, not just the tapping, but something else underneath. A shuffling sound, the faint whisper of movement that was definitely not mechanical. "Hello," she whispered softly against the door. "Can you hear me?" The tapping stopped immediately. For a moment there was complete silence. Then slowly, deliberately, 3 taps, 2 taps, 3 taps again. Avery's heart raced. Someone was in there. Someone was responding to her voice. But how could that be possible? The door was locked with a heavy industrial padlock, and according to Jenny, only management had keys. She spent the next 20 minutes documenting everything she could observe. The lock appeared to be relatively new, though it was difficult to tell in the dim lighting. The area around the freezer was cleaner than she remembered, as if someone had been maintaining it regularly. Most importantly, the tapping continued in response to her whispered questions, always the same pattern, 323. When she finally returned to her father's office, Miles was packing up his briefcase for the evening. "There you are," he said. "Ready to go home." "Dad, I heard it again. The tapping. And this time whoever's in there responded when I talked to them." Miles paused in his packing, studying his daughter's face. Avery was many things: imaginative, curious, sometimes stubborn, but she wasn't a liar. Her foster care background had taught her the value of honesty, and in the 2 years she had been with him, she had never fabricated stories for attention. "What do you mean?" responded. I whispered hello through the door, and the tapping stopped. Then it started again, same pattern. 3 taps, 2 taps, 3 taps. Like they were answering me. Miles sat down heavily in his desk chair. Part of him wanted to dismiss this as childhood imagination, but another part, the part that had learned to trust his instincts in business, was beginning to feel uneasy. "Avery, I want you to think carefully about this. Are you absolutely certain you heard tapping from inside that freezer?" "Yes, Dad, I'm positive." "And you think someone responded to your voice?" "I know they did." Miles rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of a decision he wasn't sure he was ready to make. If Avery was right, if there was actually someone trapped in that freezer, then every moment of delay was potentially catastrophic. But if she was wrong, if this was simply a case of childhood imagination run wild, then he would be wasting time and resources on what amounted to a ghost hunt. "All right," he said finally. "Tomorrow morning before the store opens, we'll go down there together and check it out. But Avery, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "If we don't find anything, if it turns out to be just the building settling or equipment malfunction, you have to accept that and stop investigating on your own. These basement areas can be dangerous, especially for curious children." Avery nodded solemnly. "I promise, Dad. But what if we do find someone?" Miles looked at his daughter's serious expression and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the store's air conditioning. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens." That night, neither of them slept well. Miles found himself staring at the ceiling, running through the implications of what Avery was suggesting. If someone was actually trapped in one of the store's freezer units, how had they gotten there? Why hadn't anyone noticed them missing? And most troubling of all, who had access to lock someone inside in the first place? Avery, meanwhile, lay in her bed, replaying every detail of her investigation. The new-looking padlock, the clean area around the freezer, the immediate response when she had spoken through the door. Everything pointed to someone being deliberately confined, but that seemed impossible in a store full of employees and security cameras. As the hours passed, both father and daughter found themselves grappling with the same uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the most unlikely explanations are the only ones that fit the facts. And sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who disappoint us most profoundly. The next morning dawned gray and cold, with a light snow beginning to dust the parking lot as Miles and Avery arrived at the store. They were 30 minutes early arriving, before even the opening staff, which gave them privacy for their investigation. "Remember," Miles said as they made their way through the empty store, "we're just checking to put your mind at ease. There's probably a perfectly logical explanation for what you've been hearing." But even as he said the words, Miles found himself hoping they weren't true. Because if Avery was right, if there really was someone trapped in that freezer, then someone on his staff had been lying to him for months. And that betrayal would cut deeper than any financial loss or business setback ever could. The basement level felt different in the morning light, filtering through the small windows near the ceiling. Less mysterious, but somehow more ominous. As they approached the maintenance area, Miles could see that Avery had been accurate in her descriptions. The freezer unit was indeed secured with a heavy padlock, and the area around it was unusually clean for a storage space. "This is it," Avery whispered, pointing to the metal door. "Listen." They stood in silence for several minutes but heard nothing beyond the usual mechanical sounds of the building's systems. Miles was beginning to feel relieved and slightly foolish when Avery moved closer to the door. "Hello," she called softly. "Are you there?" The response was immediate and unmistakable. 3 distinct taps followed by a pause, then 2 taps, then another pause, then 3 more taps. The sound was definitely coming from inside the freezer, and it was definitely deliberate. Miles felt his world shift on its axis. His daughter had been right. Someone was trapped inside that freezer unit, and they had been trying to communicate for who knows how long. Miles' hands shook as he examined the padlock securing the maintenance freezer. The metal was cold against his fingers, and he could see now what his daughter had noticed. This lock was indeed relatively new, much newer than the other security hardware throughout the basement. "Who has keys to this area?" he asked himself aloud, though he already knew the answer. Only 3 people had access to the maintenance freezers: himself, the facilities manager, and the store manager. Since he certainly hadn't locked anyone in there, that left 2 possibilities, neither of which he wanted to contemplate. "Dad." Ivory's voice was small and frightened. "What if they can't breathe in there? What if they're sick?" The urgency in her tone snapped Miles into action. He pulled out his phone and called Jenny, who lived only 10 minutes from the store. "Jenny, I need you to come in immediately and bring your keys to the maintenance area," he said when she answered. Is everything okay, Mr. Hawthorne?" Miles looked at his daughter, who was pressing her ear against the freezer door again, and made a decision that would change everything. "I'm not sure. Just please hurry." While they waited, Avery continued to communicate with whoever was inside. She had developed a simple system: 1 tap for yes, 2 taps for no, 3 taps for help. The responses came consistently, proving beyond doubt that there was a conscious person trapped inside. "Can you tell me your name?" she whispered through the metal. The response was a series of taps that didn't fit their established code, but Avery listened carefully and tried to interpret the pattern. After several attempts, she thought she heard something that might be Morse code, the dots and dashes Mrs. Patterson had taught her class. Jenny arrived within 8 minutes, her face flushed from rushing through the cold morning air. She took one look at Miles's expression and Avery's position by the freezer door, and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. "You really think someone's in there?" she asked quietly. "Listen," Miles said. Jenny approached the door and knocked gently. The response was immediate and clear: 3 taps, 2 taps, 3 taps. "Oh my God," she breathed. "How is this possible?" "That's what we're going to find out," Miles said grimly. "Open it." Jenny's hands trembled as she sorted through her key ring, finding the master key for the maintenance area. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet basement. Miles pulled the heavy door open, and immediately a wave of stale, cold air rushed out, carrying with it a smell that made all 3 of them step back involuntarily. It wasn't the clean, sterile smell of a properly maintained freezer. It was the smell of human habitation, unwashed clothing, food scraps, and something else that Miles didn't want to identify. "Hello," he called into the darkness. "Is someone in there?" A weak voice responded from somewhere in the depths of the freezer. "Please, help me." Miles pulled out his phone's flashlight and stepped carefully into the freezer unit. What he saw made his stomach lurch and his heart break simultaneously. Curled in the far corner, wrapped in what appeared to be old delivery blankets, was a man Miles recognized, but hadn't seen in almost a year. Joe Martin, the former maintenance worker who had simply stopped showing up for work one day and couldn't be reached at his known addresses. Joe was alive, but barely. His face was gaunt and pale, his eyes sunken with exhaustion and malnutrition. His hair and beard had grown long and unkempt, and his clothes hung loosely on a frame that had obviously lost considerable weight. "Joe," Miles said, hardly believing what he was seeing. "Joe Martin." The man's eyes focused on Miles with difficulty, as if he were having trouble processing visual information after so long in the dim freezer. "Mr. Hawthorne," Joe's voice was barely a whisper. "Is that really you?" "Yes, it's me." "Joe, what happened? How did you get in here? How long have you been trapped?" Joe tried to sit up but could barely manage to lift his head. 10 months, he said. Maybe more. I stopped counting after the first 100 days. 10 months. Miles felt the world spinning around him. Joe Martin had been trapped in this freezer for nearly a year, tapping his desperate code for help, while the store operated normally, just floors above him. "We need to get you out of here immediately," Miles said. "Jenny, call 911. Get paramedics here now." As Jenny rushed to make the call, Miles carefully helped Joe to his feet. The man was weak and unsteady, but he was alive. Against all odds, he had survived 10 months of imprisonment in a freezer that should have killed him within hours. "Dad," Avery said softly from the doorway. "Ask him about the tapping code." Miles looked at his daughter, then back at Joe. "The tapping 323. What does it mean?" Joe managed a weak smile. "Help," he said. HELP. 3 taps for H, 2 for E, 3 for L, 3 for P. I was an Eagle Scout. Learned a simple alphabet code when I was 12. "But Joe," Miles said, supporting the man as they slowly made their way out of the freezer. "How did you survive? How did you get food, water?" Joe's expression darkened. "Someone's been bringing me things. Leftovers, water bottles, old blankets. Just enough to keep me alive, but not enough to make me strong. They wanted me alive, but helpless." "Who?" Miles demanded. "Who did this to you?" Joe looked around carefully, as if afraid someone might be listening. "I found something," he said. "Something I wasn't supposed to see. When I tried to report it, they locked me up. Said if I tried to escape or if anyone found me, they'd make sure I disappeared permanently." Miles felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air from the freezer. "What did you find, Joe?" "The food swapping," Joe whispered. "Expired products, relabeled dates, thousands of dollars in profit from food that should have been destroyed." The implications hit Miles like a physical blow. Someone on his staff had been systematically defrauding the company and endangering customers by selling expired food with falsified dates. When Joe had discovered the scheme, they had silenced him in the most cruel way imaginable, by making him disappear while keeping him alive as insurance against discovery. "Who's behind it?" Miles asked. Joe's eyes flicked toward the stairway leading back up to the main store level. "I have proof," he said, "hidden in the freezer. Photos, documents, recordings, everything you need to expose them." As the paramedics arrived and began assessing Joe's condition, Miles found himself grappling with a betrayal that cut to the core of everything he believed about his business and his staff. Someone he trusted had not only stolen from the company, but had committed what amounted to kidnapping and attempted murder to cover their tracks. But even as anger and disbelief warred in his chest, he felt something else: profound gratitude for his daughter's persistence and courage. If Avery hadn't refused to dismiss the tapping sounds, if she hadn't continued investigating despite his skepticism, Joe Martin would have died in that freezer, and the truth about the food fraud would have died with him. "You saved his life," he told Avery as they watched the paramedics prepare Joe for transport to the hospital. "We saved his life," she corrected. You're the one who opened the door. I. But Miles knew better. His daughter had done the hard part. She had listened when no one else would believed, when belief seemed impossible, and persisted when every adult around her suggested she was imagining things. As Joe was loaded onto a stretcher, he grabbed Miles's arm with surprising strength. "The evidence," he said urgently. "In the freezer, behind the loose panel on the left wall. Get it before they realize I'm free." Miles nodded. Joe, who did this to you?" Joe's eyes closed with exhaustion, but he managed one more whisper. "The person you trust most." As the ambulance pulled away from Hawthorne Foods carrying Joe Martin toward medical care, he had been denied for nearly a year. Miles found himself standing in the empty parking lot with a daughter who had proven wiser than her years, and a mystery that threatened to destroy everything he had built. The person you trust most. Joe's words echoed in his mind as he and Avery returned to the basement to search for the evidence Joe had mentioned. The loose panel behind the left wall of the freezer was easy to find once you knew what to look for: a section of insulation that had been carefully cut and could be lifted away to reveal a hidden cavity. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic bags to protect them from moisture, were documents that would have made any fraud investigator's heart race. Photos of expired meat products with clearly visible original dates. Computer printouts showing inventory discrepancies that had been systematically covered up. Most damning of all, a small digital recorder containing conversations that Joe had captured while investigating the scheme. Miles plugged the recorder into his laptop and listened with growing horror as familiar voices discussed the logistics of their operation. The conversations were crystal clear, recorded over a period of several weeks, as Joe had gathered evidence. "The trick is timing," said a voice Miles recognized immediately. It was Nora Bell, the branch manager he had hired 18 months ago with such high hopes. "We pull the expired stock before the morning shift arrives, replace it with product that's close to expiration, but still sellable, and dispose of the original containers off-site." Another voice responded, Marcus Webb, the facilities manager, who had worked for the company for 8 years. "What about the inventory systems? The computers will show discrepancies." "I handle the computer entries," Nora's voice replied smoothly. "As branch manager, I have override access to the inventory database. I can adjust the records to match whatever story we need to tell." Miles felt sick as he listened to the detailed planning of a scheme that had put his customers at risk and stolen thousands of dollars from his company. But worse was yet to come. "What about Joe?" Marcus's voice asked. "He's been asking too many questions about the overnight disposal runs." "Joe's becoming a problem," Nora replied. "He's been taking photos asking to see disposal receipts. I think he knows something." "So what do we do?" There was a long pause before Nora responded, and when she did, her voice was cold and calculating. "We make him disappear. But not permanently, not yet. If he dies, there will be investigations questions. But if he just goes away, people will assume he found another job or moved away." "How?" "The maintenance freezer in the basement. It's soundproof, temperature controlled, and only we have access. We keep him there until we can figure out a permanent solution." Miles had to stop the recording as the full horror of what he was hearing sank in. This wasn't just fraud, it was premeditated kidnapping. Nora Bell, the woman he had trusted to manage one of his most important locations, had orchestrated Joe's imprisonment with the cold precision of a professional criminal. "Dad." Avery's voice was small and worried. "Are you okay?" Miles looked at his daughter and realized that she was seeing him process the worst betrayal of his professional life. The inspirational story he had always told himself about building a business based on trust and integrity was crumbling around him, replaced by the harsh reality that he had been systematically deceived by someone he had considered almost family. "I'm okay," he said, though it wasn't true. "But this is very serious, Avery. The people who did this to Mr. Joe are dangerous, and they're people I thought I could trust." The recording continued with more damning evidence. Conversations about which products to target, how to modify computer records, even discussions about what to do if Joe became too weak to survive his imprisonment. "And we can't let him die too quickly," Nora's voice said in one particularly chilling exchange. "If his body is found, there will be questions. Better to keep him alive but weak just in case we need him to cooperate with our version of events later." Marcus's voice responded, "What if someone finds him? Who's going to look? Everyone thinks he quit and moved away. His family lives in another state and he wasn't close to any of the other employees. Perfect victim, isolated, expendable, and easily explained away." Miles felt rage building in his chest as he listened to these people discuss Joe's life, as if he were nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle to their profit scheme. But beneath the anger was something even more devastating, the realization that his judgment had been fundamentally flawed. He had hired Nora, trusted her with increasing responsibilities, even recommended her for awards based on her branch's strong performance numbers. Numbers that were apparently built on fraud and endangerment of customers. The final recording was the most disturbing of all. It was Joe's own voice, obviously recorded secretly during one of Nora's visits to the freezer. "Please," Joe's voice pleaded, weak but desperate. "I won't tell anyone about the food switching. I'll quit, move away, whatever you want. Just let me go." Nora's response was delivered with terrifying calm. "I'm afraid it's too late for that, Joe. You've seen too much, documented too much. But don't worry, as long as you cooperate, as long as you stay quiet, you'll be fed and kept alive. Think of it as early retirement." "This is kidnapping," Joe's voice said. "This is a felony. When they find me—" "Who's gonna find you?" Nora interrupted. "As far as everyone knows, you quit without notice and disappeared. Happens all the time in retail. People get fed up and walk away from their lives. No one's looking for you, Joe. No one's coming to save you." But Nora had been wrong. Someone had been looking in her own way. A 9-year-old girl with sensitive hearing and an unwillingness to dismiss what adults called impossible had been listening, investigating, refusing to accept that the desperate tapping from the freezer was just mechanical noise. As Miles finished listening to the recordings, he realized that his daughter had not only saved Joe Martin's life, she had saved the integrity of the entire business. Without this evidence, Nora and Marcus could have continued their scheme indefinitely, potentially causing serious illness or even death among customers who unknowingly purchased expired food. "We need to call the police," he told Avery. "These recordings are evidence of multiple felonies." But even as he reached for his phone, Miles heard footsteps on the basement stairs. Someone was coming down, and given the early hour, and the fact that the store wasn't yet open, it was likely one of the people with management access. "Hide," he whispered to Avery, pushing her behind a stack of supply boxes. "Don't come out no matter what happens." The footsteps approached, and Miles quickly gathered the evidence and closed his laptop, trying to appear casual despite his racing heart. "Miles," Nora Bell's voice called out as she rounded the corner. "Jenny said there was some kind of emergency down here." Miles looked at the woman he had trusted for 18 months, seeing her clearly for the first time. Her professional appearance, her smooth explanations for every discrepancy, her enthusiastic embrace of company policies. It had all been a carefully constructed facade designed to hide the cold calculation of a criminal mind. "Hello, Nora," he said calmly. "Yes, we found something very interesting in the maintenance freezer." Nora's eyes flicked to the open freezer door, and Miles saw the exact moment when she realized that her secret was out. Her professional mask slipped for just an instant, revealing something predatory and dangerous underneath. "Oh," she said, recovering quickly. "What kind of something?" Miles held up the digital recorder, watching as Nora's face went completely white. "The kind of something that's going to send you to prison for a very long time." The confrontation in the basement of Hawthorne Foods lasted only minutes, but for Miles, it felt like hours. Nora Bell stood frozen for a moment after seeing the recorder, her mind clearly racing through options and calculations. Her career of manipulation and control had trained her to always have an exit strategy, but she had never planned for the possibility that her victim would be rescued by the intuition of a child. "You don't understand," she said finally, her voice taking on the persuasive tone that had served her so well in management meetings. "This isn't what it looks like. Joe was embezzling from the company. I was trying to get evidence." "Stop," Miles said firmly. "I've heard the recordings, Nora. Your own voice planning his imprisonment, discussing how to keep him weak but alive. There's no explanation you can give that will make this anything other than what it is." Nora's composure cracked completely then, and the mask of professional competence fell away to reveal the desperate calculation beneath. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," she hissed. "This operation is bigger than just this store. There are people involved who won't appreciate having their business disrupted." "Are you threatening me?" Miles asked, though he was already reaching for his phone to call the police. "I'm giving you a chance to be smart about this," Nora replied. "You walk away, let Joe disappear quietly, and everyone wins. Keep pushing, and you'll discover that some problems are too big for a small-town grocery chain owner to handle." But Miles was no longer the trusting businessman who had hired Nora 18 months earlier. The evidence of her betrayal had burned away his naivety, leaving behind someone harder and more determined. More importantly, he was no longer alone in this confrontation. "Dad." Avery's voice came from behind the supply boxes where she had been hiding. "Should I call 911 now?" Miles smiled grimly as he realized his daughter had been listening to everything, ready to summon help if the situation escalated. "Yes, sweetheart. Tell them we need police officers immediately and that we have evidence of kidnapping and fraud." Nora spun toward the sound of Avery's voice, her eyes widening as she realized there had been a witness to their entire conversation. "The little girl," she breathed. "Hatikata, she's the one who found him." "Her name is Avery," Miles said proudly. "And yes, she's the one who saved Joe Martin's life by refusing to dismiss what every adult around her thought was impossible." The police arrived within 10 minutes, followed closely by detectives who had been alerted to the seriousness of the situation. As Nora was read her rights and led away in handcuffs, she maintained her professional composure until the very end, speaking only to request an attorney. Marcus Webb was arrested at his home 2 hours later, caught trying to destroy boxes of falsified inventory records in his backyard fire pit. Unlike Nora, he broke down immediately when confronted with the evidence, providing a full confession that revealed the scope of their operation across multiple store locations. The investigation that followed would ultimately uncover fraud totaling more than $200,000 across the Hawthorne Foods chain, along with evidence that expired food products had been knowingly sold to customers for more than a year. The health department launched an immediate review of all locations, and Miles found himself cooperating with multiple law enforcement agencies as they built their case. But even as the legal machinery ground into motion, Miles found his attention focused on the human cost of the betrayal. Joe Martin spent 3 weeks in the hospital recovering from malnutrition, dehydration, and the psychological trauma of 10 months in captivity. The doctors were amazed that he had survived at all, attributing his endurance to the small kindnesses that had kept him alive, the leftovers and water bottles that Nora had provided not out of mercy, but as a calculated strategy to keep him as a potential bargaining chip. When Miles finally visited Joe in the hospital, he found a man who had been fundamentally changed by his ordeal, but who retained a core of dignity that imprisonment couldn't touch. "I don't blame you," Joe said before Miles could speak. "You couldn't have known what she was. She fooled everyone." "I should have noticed something," Miles replied. "The discrepancies, the changes in procedure, the way she always had explanations for everything. I should have seen the pattern." Joe shook his head weakly. "You know what saved me, that little girl of yours. When I heard her voice through the door that first time, it was the first hope I'd felt in months. She kept coming back, kept trying to communicate. Even when you told her it was probably just mechanical noise, she didn't give up." Miles felt his throat tighten with emotion. "She believed in something when no one else would, including me." "Children see things differently," Joe said. "They haven't learned yet that some things are impossible. Sometimes that makes them right when everyone else is wrong." The conversation was interrupted by Avery herself, who had insisted on coming to visit Joe as soon as the doctors said he was strong enough for visitors. She carried a get-well card she had made at school, decorated with drawings of ice cream cones and smiling faces. "Hi, Mr. Joe," she said shyly. "I'm glad you're okay." Joe's eyes filled with tears as he accepted the card. "Hello, Avery. I'm glad you kept listening even when people told you not to." "I knew someone was in there," she said with the simple certainty of childhood. "I could feel it." Miles watched his daughter's interaction with the man she had saved and realized that he was witnessing something profound. This wasn't just about fraud or kidnapping or corporate betrayal. It was about the power of believing in truth, even when that truth seems impossible to others. It was about the courage required to keep investigating when everyone around you suggests you're imagining things. Most importantly, it was about the bond between a father and daughter that had been tested and strengthened by crisis. Miles had learned to trust his child's instincts, and Avery had learned that persistence in the face of adult skepticism could literally save lives. As the legal proceedings continued over the following months, the story of Joe's rescue became something of a local sensation. Journalists wanted to interview the little girl who had solved a case that had stumped adults for nearly a year. But Miles was careful to protect Avery from too much attention, understanding that her motivational drive to help others was something to be nurtured, not exploited. The inspirational aspect of the story wasn't lost on the community. Here was proof that wisdom could come from unexpected sources, that the smallest voices sometimes carried the most important messages. Schools began inviting Miles and Avery to speak about the importance of listening to children and trusting intuition, even when it contradicted logic. But for Miles, the real lesson was more personal. He had learned that building a successful business required more than good systems and trusted employees. It required the humility to admit when you might be wrong, the wisdom to listen to perspectives that seemed impossible, and the courage to act on incomplete information when someone's life might be at stake. As Joe recovered and eventually returned to work in a new position with better pay and a written guarantee that his whistleblowing would be protected, Miles found himself changed by the experience. The betrayal had wounded him, but it had also taught him valuable lessons about trust verification and the importance of maintaining skeptical oversight, even of his most trusted employees. 6 months after Joe Martin's rescue, Hawthorne Foods reopened its flagship store with new management, upgraded security systems, and a comprehensive ethics training program for all employees. The rebuilding process had been painful but necessary, requiring Miles to examine every aspect of his business operations and implement safeguards that would prevent future fraud. But for Miles, the real healing came from watching his relationship with Avery deepen and mature in the aftermath of their shared crisis. The experience had taught them both valuable lessons about trust communication and the importance of taking each other seriously, even when initial reactions suggested skepticism. "Dad," Avery said one evening as they walked through the renovated store together, "do you think there will be other people who need help that grown-ups don't believe exist?" Miles considered the question carefully. His daughter had developed a reputation in their small community as someone who noticed things others missed, and he had learned to take her observations seriously, even when they seemed unlikely. "Probably," he said honestly. "The world is full of people whose voices aren't being heard, whose problems aren't being seen. Sometimes it takes someone with fresh eyes and an open heart to notice what everyone else has learned to ignore." They paused in front of the basement access door, which now bore a small plaque that read, "In memory of those whose voices go unheard, and in honor of those who listen." It had been Avery's idea to install the memorial, and Miles had been moved by his daughter's desire to ensure that Joe's suffering and rescue were remembered. Joe himself had become a regular presence in their lives, joining the family for dinner once a week and serving as an unofficial security consultant for the store's new anti-fraud measures. His experience, as traumatic as it had been, had given him unique insights into the vulnerabilities that criminals could exploit in retail operations. The weekly dinners had become more than just social occasions. They were healing rituals for all three of them. Joe would share stories from his recovery, describing the small victories and setbacks that marked his journey back to normal life. Miles would update him on the business improvements and new safeguards they had implemented. And Avery would tell them both about her school activities and the various people she had noticed who might need help. "You know what I learned in that freezer," Joe told them one evening over dinner, his voice stronger now than it had been in months. "I learned that hope can survive almost anything as long as someone somewhere believes in your existence." Even when I couldn't see any way out, knowing that Avery was listening, that she refused to dismiss what she heard, it kept me going through the darkest moments. Miles had noticed that Joe still struggled with claustrophobia and sudden noises, but his fundamental optimism had gradually returned. More remarkably, Joe had channeled his experience into advocacy work, speaking at law enforcement conferences about the psychology of long-term captivity and the importance of investigating even the most unlikely missing person reports. The conversation had sparked something in Avery's mind, and she had begun volunteering with a local organization that worked with missing persons cases. Her job was simple: to listen to family members who felt their concerns weren't being taken seriously by authorities and to help document details that might otherwise be overlooked. Me too. Children notice different things than adults. The organization's director had explained to Miles when Avery first expressed interest in volunteering. They ask different questions, focus on different details. Sometimes that fresh perspective is exactly what's needed to break a case open. Miles had been initially hesitant to involve his daughter in such serious work, but he had learned to trust her instincts and her desire to help others. Under careful supervision, Avery had already contributed to 2 successful missing person investigations, both cases where her attention to seemingly minor details had provided crucial breakthroughs. The first case involved an elderly man with dementia who had wandered away from his care facility. While adults focused on searching obvious locations like parks and shopping centers, Avery had asked a simple question: what made him happy when he was younger? Her inquiry led them to discover that the man had been a railroad enthusiast, and they found him safely sitting at an abandoned train station, watching freight cars pass by. The second case was even more remarkable. A teenage girl had been missing for 3 days, and police were treating it as a probable runaway situation. But when Avery listened to the girl's mother describe their last conversation, she noticed something that everyone else had missed. The mother mentioned that her daughter had seemed excited about a secret project at school. While adults dismissed this as typical teenage behavior, Avery suggested they check the school building itself. They found the girl trapped in a storage room where she had been working on a surprise art installation for her mother's birthday, injured by falling supplies and unable to call for help. The experience had also strengthened Miles's commitment to ethical business practices. He had implemented an anonymous reporting system that allowed employees to raise concerns about fraud or misconduct without fear of retaliation. More importantly, he had created a culture where questions and concerns were welcomed rather than dismissed, where even the youngest voices were given respectful consideration. I used to think that running a business was about having all the answers, he reflected during a community speaking engagement. But I've learned that it's really about being willing to listen to all the questions, especially the ones that seem impossible or inconvenient. The legal proceedings against Nora Bell and Marcus Webb had concluded with substantial prison sentences for both conspirators. The evidence that Joe had collected, combined with the additional documentation uncovered during the investigation, had built an ironclad case that resulted in guilty pleas and cooperation with authorities to identify other potential fraud schemes in the region. But for Miles, the most satisfying resolution came from watching Joe rebuild his life and regain his confidence. The 10 months of imprisonment had left psychological scars that would take years to heal, but Joe's fundamental strength and dignity had survived the ordeal intact. "I want people to understand," Joe said during his victim impact statement at Nora's sentencing hearing, "that this wasn't just about money or fraud. This was about someone deciding that my life didn't matter, that I could be disposed of like expired merchandise. But they were wrong. Every life matters. Every voice deserves to be heard. And sometimes, the smallest voice is the one that saves you." The judge had been visibly moved by Joe's statement and by the presence of 9-year-old Avery in the courtroom gallery sitting beside her father as a reminder of the courage it had taken to rescue someone everyone else had given up for dead. As the months passed, the story of Avery's persistence and Joe's rescue became a touchstone for the community's understanding of justice and compassion. Local schools incorporated the story into their curricula as an example of how individual actions could make a profound difference in the world. But for Avery herself, the experience had been transformative in more subtle ways. She had learned that her voice mattered, that her observations were valuable, and that adults were willing to listen when she presented her concerns thoughtfully and persistently. "I used to think that grown-ups always knew better," she told her class during a presentation about the experience. "But I learned that sometimes adults stop noticing things because they get used to them. Children notice things because everything is still new to us. Both kinds of noticing are important." Miles watched his daughter speak with pride and amazement. The shy child who had joined his family 2.5 years earlier had developed into someone with confidence, wisdom, and a deep sense of justice. The experience of being right when everyone else was wrong had given her a foundation of self-trust that would serve her well throughout her life. During the months following Joe's rescue, Miles had witnessed profound changes in his daughter that went beyond simple confidence. Avery had developed an almost supernatural ability to read situations and people, a skill honed by the experience of having to convince adults that the impossible was possible. Teachers at her school began consulting with her when other children seemed withdrawn or troubled, recognizing that she possessed an intuitive understanding of when someone needed help. "She sees what we miss," Mrs. Patterson explained to Miles during a parent-teacher conference. Last week she noticed that Tommy Henderson had been unusually quiet and kept touching his stomach. When I investigated, we discovered he'd been going without lunch for 3 days because his family was having financial difficulties. Avery's observation led us to connect the family with our assistance program. These discoveries didn't surprise Miles anymore. His daughter had learned to trust her instincts completely, and more importantly, she had learned that her observations mattered. The validation she had received from saving Joe's life had given her the courage to speak up about smaller concerns, creating a ripple effect of positive intervention in their community. The store itself had been physically unchanged by the ordeal, but its atmosphere was different now. Employees were more engaged, more willing to speak up about concerns, more attentive to details that seemed out of place. The culture of fear and intimidation that Nora had created had been replaced by one of openness and mutual support. "We learned that secrets are dangerous," Miles explained to a business journal that featured the story in an article about corporate fraud prevention. "When people feel they can't speak up about problems, those problems grow in the darkness until they become crises. Our job as leaders is to make sure the light can reach every corner of our operations." As Winter returned to their small town, exactly 1 year after Avery had first heard the tapping in the freezer, father and daughter established a new tradition. Every week, they would walk through the store together, not as owner and family member, but as partners in maintaining the values that had saved Joe's life and preserved the integrity of their family business. "Do you hear anything unusual tonight?" Miles would ask as they made their rounds. "Just the normal sounds," Avery would typically reply. But sometimes she would pause, listen carefully, and add, "But I'm paying attention just in case." And Miles knew that she was. His daughter had learned that listening carefully, believing in what seemed impossible, and refusing to be dismissed were not just valuable traits. They were essential skills for anyone who wanted to make the world a safer, more just place for vulnerable people everywhere. The anniversary of Joe's rescue had become an informal community holiday, with local organizations hosting events focused on the themes of listening, believing, and protecting the vulnerable. Schools organized Avery Day activities, where children were encouraged to share observations that adults might have dismissed. The police department created a special hotline for reports that seemed unlikely but persistent. Even the hospital where Joe had recovered established a program for training staff to listen more carefully to family members who insisted something was wrong, despite normal test results. One child's courage to speak up changed our entire community's approach to listening, the mayor said during the first annual commemoration. "We learned that wisdom doesn't always come from those with the most experience. Sometimes it comes from those with the clearest vision." As I finish sharing this remarkable story with you tonight, I'm struck by how often we encounter moments in our own lives when we must choose between dismissing what seems impossible and having the courage to investigate further. Avery Scott's refusal to accept that the tapping in the freezer was just mechanical noise saved Joe Martin's life and exposed a criminal conspiracy that could have continued for years. But more than that, her persistence reminded an entire community that wisdom can come from the most unexpected sources. How many times have we dismissed the concerns of children, the elderly, or others whose voices we've learned not to hear? How many Joe Martins are still waiting in metaphorical freezers, hoping someone will listen to their desperate signals for help? This story challenges us to examine our own willingness to believe in what others dismiss, to investigate what seems impossible, and to trust the intuition that tells us something isn't right, even when everyone around us suggests we're imagining things. The next time someone shares a concern that seems unlikely or inconvenient, remember Avery's example. The next time your own instincts tell you something is wrong, even when logic suggests otherwise, remember Joe's gratitude for the one person who refused to stop listening. Sometimes the most profound act of love is simply believing someone when no one else will. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power we all have to be someone's unexpected rescue, I hope you'll share it with others who need that reminder. And please tell me in the comments about a time when listening to an unlikely voice made all the difference in your own life. Until our paths cross again in another story, remember the smallest voices sometimes carry the most important messages.